Brett, you're one of the most respected individuals in trucking. All the individuals I speak with every day about you on a regular basis say, Mr. Suma knows economics of trucking better than anybody. So Brett, let's dive into this. What do the economics of traditional trucking look like?
Well, I don't know who you speak with, Grayson, but I appreciate the compliments. I think the economics of trucking, they're pretty straightforward if you've worked at a trucking company for any period of time. But there's big line items that are drivers of the unit economics of trucking. And I think it's important really for people to recognize that trucking and the most successful trucking companies look at unit economics. And so however they're measuring their business, they're going to do it in a very unit way. And so whether you're looking at revenue per truck per day, revenue per truck per week, revenue per truck per hour, depending on your business and how your business is operating, revenue per mile, obviously, when you start looking at things like fuel surcharge per mile, your deadhead miles, your out of route miles, all of the things that build into those unit economics, that is the basis of trucking. So you have to look at things at a unit economic perspective. And so even if you're thinking about a power only freight brokerage like Loadsmith, where we're currently at in our roadmap, we look at the unit economics of our trailers. And so what are our miles per trailers per week? What is our revenue per trailer per day? What is our revenue per trailer per week? We lease our trailers on a per trip basis. So how many lease rentals per month are we having per trailer? That level of granularity in terms of what are you doing to generate revenue on your assets is extremely important. And let's not forget that your assets in most trucking companies, the driver is going to be the most highly compensated asset that you're paying on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And so you have to factor in driver pay significantly. And it's not just driver pay, it's everything associated with the cost of the driver. And we'll dive into that a little bit further as we talk about the unit economics of autonomous and why autonomous can actually be a more expensive per mile play, but actually be a savings because of the distribution of cost from the infrastructure needed to run a human-based trucking company versus an autonomous-based trucking. And so I think that when you think about trucking companies and you think about transportation, unit economics has to be the only thing that you focus on. You can go down the rabbit hole in terms of how you want to look at them. But at the end of the day, we're still an industry that gets paid in cents per mile. Let's be honest. When you get a rate increase, you're not getting a dollar rate increase. You're getting some level of cents per mile on a rate increase, on a rate reduction as well. Driver pay is a cents per mile type of thing. And so everything is always distilled down to the unit economics.
That's Brett Suma, founder and CEO of Loadsmith. Brett joined me on the Road to Autonomy economy today to discuss the economics of autonomous trucking and why self-balancing freight networks are the future of trucking. Where does insurance factor in this? We're seeing skyrocketing insurance prices in the freight industry. How do you account for that? Do you pass on those costs? How does that factor into the model?
Well, I think that we're in an interesting period of time with the RFPs that are coming out because to your point, Grayson, if you were to look at the unit economics of most trucking companies and look at the stalwarts of the industry in terms of what their performance has been, even stripping out things like one-time expenditures, if you look at Heartland as an example, and if you were to even strip out their one-time costs associated with their acquisitions and their inability to integrate those acquisitions at the historical performance that Heartland has had, or if you look at Knight from a performance perspective, stripping out their insurance or their Embark investment or their iron maintenance platforms. Stripping those things out, they still are not performing at the level that they historically have. And so I think that there's a lot built into that. Drivers, wages, those are always going to be, there's always going to be pressure there. Equipment costs, always going to be additional pressure. And then insurance is, and those are the three big things really, right? And so when you think about insurance, what are the things that are driving insurance? Well, obviously lawsuits, obviously the Warner nuclear verdict, which we'll see what happens in that one. So insurance, whether you're talking cargo or liability insurance, those are things that are real issues. And when you look under the hood at a trucking company, especially a large one, and you start looking at that insurance line item, and again, it's going to be a unit economics. So it's going to be what is the insurance on a per mile basis as a percentage of revenue. So when you look at all trucking companies report their operating ratio as kind of their one number that they look at. And so what percentage of a dollar is insurance, or what is the cost per mile for insurance? And so there's ways that you can work through that. I always was a fan of increasing the denominator in anything I did. What I mean by that is if I can increase the revenue, if I can increase the miles, if I can decrease the empty miles at the same time while increasing miles, those are all going to have positive effects in terms of whatever that numerator is. But insurance is a big, big thing, and it's not going to get cheaper. And I think as an industry, we have to do everything that we can to make trucking safer, right? Like that's the big thing. Like, how do we make trucking safer? And not just for the motoring public, but how do we make it safer for the employee? How do we make it safer for the driver? How do we have less workers' comp issues? I mean, nobody wants to get hurt on the job, right? So how do we have less workers' comp? How do we have safer highways? How do we have safer left-hand turns, as an example? How do we build in safety systems to help manage driver behavior and alert driver behavior and those types of things? And I'm a big fan of studying sleep, and how do we create a better job for drivers to where their sleep patterns are more consistent and they're not behind the wheel in a fatigued state. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing just from a safety aspect that will affect the overall insurance rate. But then you also have to deal with fraud and theft and double brokering and all the other things related to cargo. So we definitely are in an uphill battle when it comes to insurance, but driver pay is always going to be a thing, equipment costs and insurance costs. And people talk about fuel, and it's funny, the layman's that know that I'm in the trucking business but don't understand how fuel surcharges work always say, oh, is fuel killing you? Well, it always just gets passed right on to the customer. So fuel is kind of one that's less of an important thing, although it can, if you're not a very well-ran trucking company, it really can be a significant impact on you. But really, driver wages, equipment, and then safety, really insurance are the three big tickets.
The airlines are famous for, the Southwest particularly, hedging fuel costs. Do any of the trucking companies hedge their fuel costs through contracts, perhaps?
I know of some that have done that, Grayson. I will tell you that the largest trucking companies buy their fuel at such high levels in such a bulk way that whatever the retail price that they're paying, the rack price that they're paying is significantly less than the retail price. And they're bulk fueling. So if you look at the largest trucking companies, they're all going to tell every single driver to fuel at their yard always, to completely fill up their yard, because they're buying fuel in tankers, not in tanks. And so their bulk fuel price is always much, much less than the retail fuel price. But then fuel surcharge is calculated on the retail price. So the reality of it is that most of your largest trucking companies, fuel can actually be a tailwind for them, especially during a declining fuel period of time. If things are just moving sideways from a fuel perspective, most trucking companies are just fine. If fuel is falling in price on a week-on-week basis, trucking companies are making a lot of money on fuel. The alternative is true. If fuel spikes and has a significant increase in the opposite direction, then they'll be behind, because you're always billing this week's loads at last week's fuel price. And so that 1 week delay creates opportunities, but also headwinds depending on which direction fuel's going. Fuel's kind of just been bouncing along plus or minus 5 cents. And most fuel brackets are 5-cent fuel brackets. And so you're really talking about like 1 cent up or down in terms of fuel surcharge. And it's been that way pretty consistently. But when you start to see fuel go from, if fuel went from $4.05 a mile to $3.50 a mile, that would indicate a 55-cent drop, which would be about a 6 cent per mile increase in just straight bottom line revenue for the carrier, because of the fact that they're billing last week's fuel and paying this week's price. Now, also, they're not buying fuel at retail. They're buying it at a much lower rate than retail. So I just know from experience that I ran a business unit of night at one point that our fuel cost was actually negative for a quarter because of that.
Let's say you have negative fuel costs, but can that offset the cost of insurance costs? Because I want to give some numbers here. Between 2010 and 2018, the number of insurance claims reported above $1 million increased 867%. For our listeners and viewers who are unsure, the minimum for trucks is $750,000. So you have that issue. And then in 2022, JB Hunt reported insurance and expense claims increased 92.7%. Unfortunately, the trends continue as JB Hunt's 2024 insurance premiums are increasing 50 to 60%, even with the most network efficiencies, the margin potentially there in the fuel. How do these companies afford these insurance costs? It seems that it's a runaway train with no station or nothing to stop it at the moment.
Yeah, I think that you have to look at, is it the value of insurance claims that are going up, or is it is it severity or is it frequency, right? So if it's a frequency issue, if it's that you've increased your frequency of accidents and incidents 92%, that's a big, big problem, right? But if it is simply just a function of the dollar of value associated with it, right? So frequency is a big problem because that can indicate some lack of institutional control type things, right? And most of your large fleets are not going to have lack of institutional control. You may have unfortunately a bad accident, but it's not going to be because of just, gross negligence. So I would venture to say that it's less of a frequency thing and more of a dollar value. And so more of a severity component. But look, when you go through a pricing exercise with a customer and you're running it from a fleet perspective, and look, let's be honest, the majority of freight in the United States is hauled under contract. And which means that it's being priced by somebody who has some sense of an understanding of the cost structure of their carrier, right? There's really two ways to price things. You can price things cost-based pricing. All of your fleets are going to do cost-based pricing. And then you can do yield-based pricing. And yield-based pricing is simply, I don't know what the cost is going to be. That's how probably a traditional brokerage looks at things is, I'm just going to get the highest rate that I possibly can win the freight from and then figure out how to operate that at less than what the yield was. I think that when you understand your costs as a trucking company, you're always going to cost-based price things. And so that's going to be baked into whatever rate you supply the customer. So I think, Grayson, what you're really talking about is that the stage is being set for probably some healthier rate increases second half of 24 going into 25, because the cost basis of all of the large trucking companies have increased, whether you're talking about insurance, driver pay, or equipment. There's no doubt that they're increasing. So I think that right now, very difficult to get a high single digit rate increase. I think second half of this year and going into next year, that's going to kind of be the norm in order to keep up with that cost that you're talking about. So majority of freight's contract. The majority of it means it's going to be cost-based pricing. So insurance increases are going to be built into those next round of rate increases.
How do the small carriers survive with these escalating costs?
I mean, typically, smaller carriers are going to can have a lower cost base. And I say can, depending on the cost of their equipment, really. And so depending on the cost of their equipment, they can have a lower cost basis than a large enterprise. When you think about a larger trucking company and the infrastructure that has to exist in order to support the organization, there's a tremendous amount of people who don't drive and create revenue. The smaller the trucking company, the higher percentage of employees drive and create revenue. And so there is this balance that happens. And look, there's no doubt that some trucking companies are overstaffed in terms of the people who don't drive and create revenue, right? But the most well-ran large trucking companies are going to understand. You talk about unit economics. So one of the unit economics that a trucking company probably measures is their headcount to tractor ratio. So what is the number of office people working compared to the number of tractors that they have running? That when trucking companies talk about headcount, that's really what they're talking about from a unit economic perspective. And so I think smaller trucking companies, again, depending on their choice in terms of equipment, because they're not going to have the same buying power that the largest fleets are going to have in terms of buying the truck for the least amount. But if they're smart, if they buy a gently used truck, if they buy an optioned truck where it's not the most expensive options truck or trailers, if they're smart in their equipment purchasing and then they really manage their headcount, so their non-driver headcount, they really can compete. But what that means is that they're going to have less support and those types of things for the drivers. Then again, you're probably in a smaller category trucking company having a more experienced driver as opposed to a new entrant driver that's coming into one of the largest fleets, because that's where the large fleets generally get their drivers, is new to the industry or newer to the industry. Not to minimize that there's plenty of drivers that have had 20, 30-year careers with the largest trucking companies. But generally speaking, the new hires are newer entrants. So I think that smaller trucking companies can compete with very competent drivers that don't get into accidents, that are efficient in their time management, that are consistent in their ability to pick up and deliver on time. They understand fuel and how driving behavior can affect that. But they are going to have less. They're probably not going to have as nice facilities. They're not going to have a bowling alley. They're not going to have a basketball court at their facility, but they're going to be, out on the road making money. So I think that that's how they can compete. But they also have to align with shippers and in some cases, what I would say is good freight brokers. So freight brokers that recognize that paying fair and paying quickly and accurately is a very important part of our job from a freight brokerage perspective.
How are the economics going to change when autonomous trucks are introduced into the equation?
Well, the whole thing's going to change. The entire economics of trucking are going to change, and not in every lane on day one, and not even in every lane forever, right? But the economics of, let's just call it your 20 most dense lanes in the United States, are going to probably change very drastically, very quickly. And then it will continue to expand to the top 100 lanes from a density perspective. And it may settle in somewhere 150 to 250 total lanes that can support autonomous from an economics perspective. And I think that the can component is an important part, not the able to, meaning we're able to run autonomous in some places that it doesn't support it from an economics perspective. I think we're going to talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about Texas. But the fact is that the economics are going to change completely on the largest 20 most dense lanes in the very beginning. And it's going to be a little gradual and it will accelerate rather quickly. And then it will expand out beyond that. And so the economics are going to change in this regard. First off, as long as I have been in trucking, the real shame of it has been that the highest paid drivers typically have been drivers that have been willing to sacrifice the most. So what I mean by that is the irregular route, on the road for 6 weeks at a time type of driver, or expedited team driving, back and forth across the country, disruptive sleep patterns, all over the place in terms of sleeping in the truck while the other driver's driving, all of those things that have been sacrifices. Generally, those are the highest paying trucking jobs. And that first and last mile job where you start every morning at 6 a.m. and you're off at 3 is typically the lowest paying driving job. Now, the irony in that is that first and last mile driving is very difficult. You're bumping docks, you're backing, you're navigating streets more frequently, tighter quarters. It's a very stressful job doing a first and last mile job. And not to minimize being an over the road driver is also stressful. But it's always been this weird thing where the first and last mile driver always was kind of deemed like they sacrificed less, so they got paid less. And so that's an interesting thing that I think will change. But really, when you start thinking about the economics of autonomous. So first off, let's just talk about the availability of the tractor. So available drive hours of the tractor. Well, if you build your network correctly, and we can talk about what that means, but if you build your network correctly for autonomous, so you look at the available uptime of the truck, and then how does that compare to a human driver? Well, every time I do the utilization scoring of autonomous, it lands somewhere between 2.3 and 2.8 from a utilization perspective. So I just say 2.3. So we know that the autonomous truck can operate 2.5 times more than a single individual driver. That doesn't mean that you can't slip seat a tractor. That doesn't mean that you can't utilize a team and have the benefit of that same level of uptime. However, that is a lot harder to do than programming an autonomous truck to do it. So we know that we can capture 2.5 times more uptime of the tractor. But then now we have to deploy that tractor in the right way in order to take advantage of that potential uptime. And so you have to put it in a very, very, almost in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that the truck is just going to do one thing. It's going to go from point A to point B and from point B back to point A. And if you do that continuously with that tractor, all of a sudden that utilization is just really, really working in your favor. Now, in order to do that, though, you're going to have a local driver on either end picking up and delivering the freight. And the only way to make that work from a unit economic perspective is to street turn it. And what I mean by that is that you actually have to take the delivery, deliver it to the customer, go to the shipper, pick up, and come back to the yard. So one first last mile driver has to pick up, deliver the last mile, pick up the first mile, and come back. And so really, when you talk about building the operational design domain for autonomous, what you're talking about is how do I take every single load and break it into three pieces and then put it back together in such a way where the unit economics work on the street turn, and that middle mile is just bouncing the autonomous truck back and forth between point A and point B. And so it's going to be the force multiplication of first and last mile jobs. And so my oldest brother is a truck driver, and he sometimes is frustrated that I am so into autonomous because of the implications, right? What I tell him is, his name's Keith. He said, Keith, what I'm trying to do is create an environment where there's so much demand for first and last mile drivers that the wages actually are transferred from that middle mile, from that irregular route, from that driver that doesn't really want to be gone for 6 weeks at a time to the first and last mile, and create such demand for that first and last mile driver that the wages increase accordingly. But one of the other things that's going to have to happen, and this is what I think is interesting for drivers to really hone in on, is that as long as I have been in the industry, and tomorrow is my 25th anniversary of being in this business, and as long as I have been in the business, the inefficiency that exists in freight has always been shouldered by the driver. And the reason being is because the driver, even as a percentage of revenue, has always had a pay structure in a way where if it takes them longer from a pickup and delivery perspective, they still get paid the same because they get paid by the mile. And drivers, for the most part, don't have anything to do with the scheduling of the pickup and the delivery. So they can pick up a load that's, 500 miles in length that picks up today at 8 a.m. and delivers tomorrow at 8 a.m. They also can pick up that load that picks up at 8 a.m. today and not deliver it till noon tomorrow or until 6 p.m. tomorrow. But they still get paid by the mile for those 500 miles. And so the reality is that at the same time that we're creating a higher level of utilization of the autonomous truck, we're also being the force multiplier of first and last mile jobs, which is going to create more demand, which is going to increase wages for those. But at the same time, what is going to happen is that inefficiency that has always existed, that has always been shouldered by the driver, is going to have to be replaced by the trailer. And so you're going to see larger trailer fleets to be able to support autonomy. Coming back to the unit economic side of things, what is your trailer to tractor ratio? So typical trucking, the most efficient trailer utilization trucking companies are probably refrigerated companies, right? Most refrigerated companies are going to operate a 1-to-1 or maybe a 1.25-to-1. On the extreme side, maybe 1.5-to-1. In dry van, that range can go from 2.2 to 3, sometimes 3.5. In a dedicated scenario, maybe 5, right? A dedicated retail business, maybe 5. The reality with autonomous, though, is that in order to make that truck have a 2.5 utilization score, you're going to have a higher trailer to tractor ratio. And what that is going to do is shift the inefficiency of the load from the driver to that inanimate object. And what will happen as time goes on is that irregular route over the road truck driving job is going to price itself out of adding additional trailers, because the driver just needs to be making more money than what they're making in the irregular route world. There's just no question about it. And so that labor rate is going to have to be a consideration for trucking companies. And at some point, that labor rate is going to hit the tipping point where it costs less to increase your trailer ratio than it does to make your driver inefficient. So the economics of everything changes with autonomous, because you're going to be shifting where and how you're spending money out from the middle mile and shifting it into the first and last mile jobs and wages, and shifting it from inefficiency of freight to additional trailer capacity so that you're able to do all of the math. And at the end of the day, it's just a giant math problem, right? So you take all of your freight today. How do you break it into three pieces? How do you put it back together into a street turn? But the unit economics of autonomous do not work if you're not able to create street turns. I think, again, that's the big thing that If you're not working on the operational design domain today on how you're going to be able to do that for the future, then you're behind.
Which raises the question you brought up earlier. How do you build the right network? How do you optimize for this hybrid world where the middle mile is autonomous and the first and last mile are human driven?
Well, maybe if we jump to the Texas question, because I think that I can answer this question with the Texas question. And so if you want to ask the Texas question.
Around the lane, around the Houston lane?
Yeah.
Let's look at a lane, for example, here. Everybody's obsessed, and there's an obsession. This is like putting up a pinup poster on the wall as a kid. Dallas to Houston. Everybody wants to do that lane. No matter which way I run the economics, I can't get to any profitability. So I talk to your peers and competitors in the brokerage space. They can't get it. So I'm not the only one. How are they going to make money on this lane? It just seems that it's just going to lose money and it's not a profitable lane.
Yeah. So I'm going to take those two questions and combine them into one answer. Okay. I am not a Dallas to Houston guy. And what I mean by that is that the unit economics of that don't work. They don't work for autonomous. In the current environment, in supply and demand in that lane, and specifically supply related to demand in that lane, and in the way in which freight moves back and forth in that lane, and because of supply, what the rate is, the unit economics don't work. And I have made that clear to any autonomous truck developer that I have spoke with. The unit economics of that lane do not work. Now, the obsession of that lane is this. You have to test something and you have to test somewhere, right? And so if the great state of Texas is allowing you to do that and allowing you to test in that particular lane, and there's enough customer volume and enough customers that are willing and allowing you to test as well in that particular lane, then that's what you're going to do. You're going to test and build use case around where you can do it. Now, there's other reasons why you would do it there in terms of weather. So there's a lot of reasons why you should be focused on that now. But when you're talking about like the use case in the future, that is not a lane for me that I get excited about at all. The unit economics just aren't going to work in the current construct that exists in that particular lane. So when you're looking at building a network of freight, what are your power lanes? What are your primary lanes? What are your secondary lanes? And what are your support lanes? And so I think that any trucking company is going to build their business around that methodology. Okay, so let me give you an example. If we were to go back to the mid 2000s and said, okay, Grayson, we're going to open a new terminal in Dallas, Texas. So we're going to send you to Dallas and you're going to open the terminal and you're going to basically create a trucking company under our brand, but in Dallas. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're going to go there and we're going to pick Dallas because it's going to have a high amount of outbound freight. It has to be somewhere close to an intersection of two major trade routes, right? So two major freeways. It's going to have a population that is large enough to support 125 to 150 drivers. So the population of the city has to have enough population and enough percentage of that population that are Class 8 truck drivers to support 125 to 150 tractors, enough outbound to get those drivers out of the house by Tuesday, meaning whatever day they happen to come home. Okay. Enough inbound to be able to get the drivers home, because there's no point of starting a trucking company in a town where you can't get your driver home. Don't see a lot of drivers, living in trucking companies headquartered in Albuquerque because of the outbound, right? A lot of freight getting drivers home, not a lot of freight getting the drivers out. So you do that and you say, okay, well, and then now what are the lanes that we can run out of this particular trucking company, out of Dallas? And so you would say, well, what are our primary lanes? And primary lanes are going to be lanes that have enough density and that you can run back and forth between. So let's just say Dallas to Memphis, Dallas to Kansas City, Dallas to Atlanta, Dallas to LA. And so you say, well, those are going to be some primary lanes for us because there's enough volume that just flows back and forth that we can do those. Now, it also is helpful what if we're part of a trucking company and we're opening Dallas, but we also have a facility in Atlanta. We also have a facility in Kansas City. We also have a facility in Los Angeles, right? Now I'm kind of connecting the dots. And so now the next component of it is, so what are our power lanes? Are going to be those lanes that we know we can just run back and forth. Okay. Our primary lanes are going to be the lanes for us that are outbound head hauls. So where we're going to make a ton of money leaving the market. Okay. Secondary lanes are going to be lanes that get us to a market that gets us to another market. So, or gets us in primary. And then the last is those support lanes are the lanes that get us back to where we want our drivers to be. Setting up an autonomous freight network is no different. The only problem that you have to figure in is what is the regulatory environment? And that's why everybody's so focused on Dallas to Houston, because of the regulatory environment. But as the regulatory environment becomes much clearer in terms of where you can operate, when I think of the Loadsmith Freight Network, I think about building that trucking company that I just described, Grayson, but building it in a virtual way. So not having the brick and mortar and not having to have the 150 tractors myself, but does the market build and able to support 150 trucks? And so when I look at an RFP as an example, when I'm going through them, where I'm focused heavily on is where do I know I can always buy a truck? Where do I know drivers live? So like we have, at Loadsmith, and not every freight brokerage operates this way, but again, we're trying to build the autonomous freight network. Like we're not trying to build the greatest freight brokerage. God bless the people who want to do that. So for us, we have a big business rule. We don't haul from the middle of nowhere to the middle of nowhere. We don't even really like to haul anywhere that's in the middle of nowhere, to orphan. And simply because what we would rather spend our time doing is booking 100 loads today from Los Angeles to Phoenix, as opposed to one load from New Mexico to Albuquerque to Billings, Montana. So we focus in on building our freight network just like a trucking company would. Although what we're just saying is we're doing it virtually right now. And so we just want to continue to grow our footprint. And then whenever autonomous happens, and we could say it's the end of this year, we could say it's next year, it could be 2030. But whenever autonomous happens, then we just say, oh, now we can just drop that capacity in that trucking company that we already built without any trucks.
You have a very optimized model for economics. Why did you build the Loadsmith framework? Did you focus on your economic background? What did you see in the market that allowed you to now's the opportunity to build this network?
Well, I think from my perspective, Grayson, if you were to wind back to like 2016, I had my 17th anniversary and kind of realized at that point in time that I wanted to work for 20 years at night and started thinking about what the future was going to hold. And so I was very open to new technology and even new industry during that period of time of my life. And I actually ended up going back to school and thought, well, if I get accepted to this program, I'm going to be around really smart people, no trucking people. I'm going to be around a lot of smart people that have a lot of great ideas. I'll learn a lot. I'll be exposed to different things and I'll figure out what I want to do. And so all along my journey of being in school, I'm engaging with great teachers, great professors, great other people. And I'm just being exposed to different ways of thinking. And then at the same time, the government came out and said the ELD mandate was coming. And then shortly thereafter, Fork Heights popped up, Project 44 popped up. And it was like, gosh, we're now changing from lack of visibility to potentially like this complete visibility. Like we know what everybody's doing. And the last 10 years that I had worked at night, really my job was optimizing the freight network at night. And so the one thing that I always got stuck on though, was that it didn't matter how great the recommendation of our algorithms were. At the end of the day, we still had the Billies and Joes saying, yes, I will do that load or no, I won't do that load. And I remember having a conversation with a gentleman named Ira, who was the investor in Fork Heights. And what he told me, and this resonated with me, he said, Brett, he's like, but if we know where all the trucks are, we know where all the loads are, how come you can't optimize better? So, well, Ira, it's the Billies and the Joes. And he said, well, but what if the trucks were robots? And that was like, to me, I was like, oh, well, you have a point there, right? And so then I ended up having to write this business plan as part of one of my courses. And I really wrote the Loadsmith business plan in that course. And really, it was like, okay, so we built our business really, we have like a roadmap, like a technology company, different than a freight brokerage, right? Like, so our roadmap though initially was, well, let's just like launch our business and start generating revenue and generating net income to reinvest into our business. And so for the first thing was like, let's just start. So we just started as a freight brokerage. We didn't really tell anybody what our plans were beyond that. It was like, hey, we're just going to be a freight brokerage. And then once we started getting the traction, then it was like, okay, now we're going to work on our tech stack. and we're going to bring trailers in. And people are like, well, you're going to bring trailers. Why are you, if you're a freight brokerage, why are you adding trailers? Well, we're going to put them on point A and point B of our freight network. Like, well, what's the plan with that? Well, then all of a sudden we're autonomous. And so now the big initiative for us is how do we do that and with a zero emission powertrain? Right. And so those are the things. And so when you look at what our roadmap is, we're still in the very early innings of our business. I always say we're like in the top of the second inning, but really it's like, let's just go and define the Loadsmith freight network. Let's just add freight to it, operate it as a freight brokerage. Then as we get a little bit more mature and have a little bit better of a technology stack, which we spent all of 23 doing, let's just start bringing trailers and putting trailers into that. And so now we have trailers and we're operating trailers. We have a great partner in Wabash from a trailers perspective. And I know that if Corey O'Brien's listening, what Corey would tell you is that we run the wheels off of our trailers. But again, we run them because we focus in on what is our miles per trailer per week? What is our revenue per trailer per week? Our trailers only do one thing. They go from point A to point B and back, right? And we keep them in that closed loop. And so that's how we're able to look at and manage through. And so again, if you're doing it that way with your trailers with a third party truck, it's not that hard to convert that truck to an autonomous truck when that's right.
How concerned are you around the unit economics around zero emission trucks? Because the cost to purchase those trucks is about 50% more on average than a traditional diesel truck.
Very concerned, Grayson. And in fact, I think the only players at scale at this point in time have enjoyed a tremendous amount of government subsidy. And so it's either going to require a significant amount of government subsidy or shipper subsidy. And look, I'm very, very pro zero emission. I'm very, very pro autonomous. I do not think because of the cost of the truck that you're going to be able to have zero emission in the middle mile at scale without it being autonomous. So I think that you can do zero emission first and last mile probably very easily. And lots of people are already doing that, and drayage work and those types of things. But at scale in the middle mile, unless you're okay with natural gas, which look, that's better than diesel from an emissions perspective. But the reality of it is that I don't think that you're going to have at scale zero emission in the middle mile without it being on an autonomous truck. It just is, again, the infrastructure doesn't exist to be able to support it. So you're going to have to roll out zero emission in the very same way that you're rolling out autonomous. And so why not just do them together?
It makes a lot of sense to do them together. The question that I talk a lot about to big commercial banks, who's going to own that asset at the end of the day? Autonomous trucking companies aren't going to want to own that asset. You're not going to want to own that asset. Who's going to want to hold it? Does commercial bank hold that paper, or who in your opinion owns that asset?
I think, Grayson, that the entire industry is changing right before our eyes. I think between now and 2030, you're going to see some movement, 2035, a lot. By 2040, it's going to look very differently. I look at Loadsmith and the Loadsmith freight network as being agnostic. And so I can envision Loadsmith trucks moving, let's say that we're holding it. Okay. So we're the paper holder, and the network exists very similarly to how the railroad exists from a network perspective. And if you want to buy capacity on the Loadsmith freight network, I don't care if it's a Loadsmith trailer, if it's a Knight Swift trailer, if it's a Hunt trailer, if it's a Walmart trailer, Kroger, it can be a reefer, a flatbed, a van. It doesn't matter to me. So I think that to your point, who wants to hold the paper? Railroads were extremely expensive to build in the beginning. Well, maybe not, because the land was pretty much given to all of them. But if you're going to try to build one today, it would be extremely expensive to do. But I look at the Loadsmith freight network as being agnostic to whatever the trailer is behind it. And so I think that there's a reimagination that's occurring in the freight world today. And look, not a lot of people think like me, and I could be completely wrong. And if I am, then I'll own it. And that's that. I just think that people who don't think like me maybe think the way that they had been doing it was really, really, really good for them. And so kind of hard, if something was really good for you, if you look at the Hunts, the Knights, Moys, the Schneiders, if you look at those long institutional trucking companies and how well it did for those people, it's hard to think about change, right? But I do believe that we've evolved along, but I believe that we're really ready for a transformation.
Yeah, I mean, Dylan sang it years ago, change is going to come, and change is coming rapidly. We have the electrification, we have autonomy. Well, you have the traditional companies are bolting on autonomous truck programs. You're building a company and a program, the autonomous freight network, from the ground up for autonomous trucks. What advantages does that give you from an economic standpoint that you're building it from the ground up versus bolting on as one of the larger fleets is doing?
I don't know if necessarily I have immediate economic advantages, Grayson, in terms of, they're obviously going to have greater buying power than we are. They're going to have more established contracts with customers, all of those things. I think that the advantage that we have, though, from not having to reconstruct our business, I think is a big advantage. I think the ability for us to build a autonomous trucking company at scale with the least amount of real estate, and we're hoping to have no real estate in the way that we build our business. So not having to have real estate, not having to have the same sense of facilities, building the network. And so it's something that I talk about a lot when we talk about smart trailers is that can we build a network and can we build technology into the trailer that supplants the need for shops and yards and inspection lanes and all of these things, and actually create the network as being so smart and the trailer is so smart and so connected that the trailer is actually telling us its health. Anytime a driver hooks to it, the inspection is telling us its health. And so the network actually becomes the home of the trailer, as opposed to it having to go to our yard or a shop or those types of things. And so I think that when you're thinking about the advantages that we have of building from scratch is that we're not doing it in a traditional sense. And so we're not going out and saying, we're going to go get 60 acres someplace and start putting trailers and build a shop and have to hire mechanics and then have to buy tool sets. And then now we have to hire somebody to make sure that our OSHA is correct in the shop. Like all of that stuff is capable of being outsourced and by professionals who do it at a very high level. And so we just want to build the smartest freight network that we can that actually becomes its own living thing. And then all of a sudden, we think that by 2035, we can be a top 50 trucking company in terms of capacity with no real estate and no drivers. And so that's a different unit economic value, right? And from a return on capital perspective, it's a different thing not having to build all that infrastructure around A, housing the equipment, and B, supporting the driver.
Highly investable. We're seeing now the global downturn in commercial real estate. You're not holding any of those assets. You're able to innovate through technology. We have this generative AI moment that's all over the world, the GTP moment. But then I look at when you bring up smart trailers, I'm not going to go to the GTP, the generative AI moment. I go back to passenger cars with the OTA over-the-air updates, where if your trailer needs an update, you can have the algorithm push out an update to that trailer or push out a fix. Preventative maintenance, that changes the game for you. Did you see that eventually becoming standardized at some point? Because the economic impact of if everybody across the industry or just across the Loadsmith fleet had standard OTA updates. Look at Tesla, for example. Look what it does for them. It changes it's a recall. It wasn't a recall. Tesla's pushed a software update. No having to go into a store to fix it. Think about the amount of millions of dollars that Tesla saved, if not tens of hundreds of millions of dollars they saved from that. You could do it.
I hope in the next week or two, you hear a little bit more from Loadsmith about smart trailers and about smart trailer platforms and around AI built into trailers. So I hope that you hear that in the very near future. And in fact, once I'm able to share that with you, I will. But to your very point, okay, one of the things that traditional automakers don't like about Tesla, but not actually the automaker, but the dealer network. Okay. What does the dealer network not like about Tesla? That they don't have dealerships. And they don't have dealerships because the majority of so the dealer would tell you, well, they need to have dealerships in order to provide service for their cars. But Teslas don't really need service, right? Like they do not need service at the same interval level that a traditional ICE engine does. So that's an interesting thing, right? Like, and so when you start thinking about not needing service intervals at the same level that you've had before, these are things that if a dealer can't wrap their head around that, I'm not sure that large enterprise trucking companies are, right? And so to your very point, Tesla, from a capital efficiency perspective, they don't have to have dealer networks. They don't have to have all of these cars sitting on lots ready for sale. That's not their sales method. You go to the mall and there's a car sitting in there and say, I'll take that one. And they'll say, okay, we'll deliver it to you. And if you have any problems, we'll come pick it up. And if your car needs any updates, we'll just send it to it and it'll update itself. right? And so to your very point, again, I think that from a smart trailer perspective and from a smart tractor, an autonomous truck, an electric drivetrain autonomous truck, you're reimagining everything in terms of the way that this business works. And that's why when you came back to say, well, what will happen to the unit economics of it? Well, the reality is that the whole thing changes. And, I think one concept that when I talk to customers about this is that when I talk to them about the elasticity of supply, so, well, bro, what does that even mean? So, well, the elasticity of supply. And so when I look at, if you're a driver in Ontario, California today, it's probably pretty slow. And that's very typical for the end of February in Southern California. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. The next few weeks are going to be even slower because of Chinese New Year, produce season, more reefer trucks hauling dry freight. There's lots of reasons why California feels very slow. And as long as I was in traditional trucking, we could never convince the 300 drivers that we had that lived for us in Southern California to move to the Southeast for the first 4 months of the year. And likewise, in the Southeast, after July 4th, when it slows down there, we could never convince the 1,000 drivers that lived in the Southeast to just move to the West Coast for the rest of the summer and into the holiday shipping season. And the reason you can't do that is because these people are people and they have wives and families and children and responsibilities. And quite frankly, they just probably really enjoy being home. And so the elasticity of supply from an autonomous perspective is that I can move my capacity around from market to market to take advantage of. And when I say take advantage of, what I'm really saying is provide capacity to the shipper, depending on what is happening in the market. And we all know that the markets are cyclical. The freight market as a whole is every single market has its own supply and demand curve. And even in that, every single lane in that market has its own supply and demand. And so the ability to move capacity along the Loadsmith freight network and provide additional service to our shippers, depending on how freight is moving at what time of the year throughout the country, is a game changer for the shipper. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about some really advanced math. Okay. But I hope in 2035, Grayson, that when I go home on a Friday afternoon, that let's say that we had 100 trucks running autonomously between Dallas and Memphis, and 100 between Memphis and Atlanta, and 100 between Atlanta and Lakeland. And I hope that our machine learning and all of our AI recognizes what's happening in the Port of Jacksonville and Savannah, what's happening in terms of incoming weather in Dallas, like all of that, right? And I come in on Monday, and 25 of those trucks that were running back and forth between Dallas and Memphis are now positioned and running between Atlanta and Lakeland, Florida, because our demand was predicted and modeled, and the trucks just moved themselves without any human interference. And so when you're talking about the future and the ability to build the future, that's why I'm so excited about Loadsmith, is because we think about what does that look like in 2035, as opposed to, and I'm not talking negatively about trucking companies, as opposed to how many people do we have in orientation for next week?
I'll summarize this way. Loadsmith's the Tesla of the freight network. You do not have traditional legacy infrastructure. You do not have dealerships. You have the ability to innovate, and you're going to out-innovate, because what you described, you're Tesla the freight network. You're 10, 20 years ahead. What you described is your version of FSD full self-drive. That's game-changing. From the autonomy side, you partnered with Kodiak. Why choose Kodiak?
Well, I love those guys. And I think that one of the reasons that I love them is because they don't think I'm crazy in the way that I talk. Okay. That's one element of it. I think the other element of it is that they are super capitally efficient, which is important to a company like Loadsmith because we are as well. And the modular way in which they're building their business, they don't have an OEM partner that they're wed to at the moment. They want to be able to build their system to be modular and used by Loadsmith on who we choose to partner with from a truck's perspective. And so I think that when I look at just their business, and look, I have the utmost respect for Don and for Michael there. One of the things when Don and I first met, and he asked me why from a Loadsmith perspective, and my answer is labor. So when you talk about Loadsmith and why we believe in autonomous, really what we believe in is how do we solve, Loadsmith has a three-pointed North Star. It's labor, it's society, and it's the environment. And so when you think about those three things, labor, obviously we believe that we can do better by truck drivers and create better jobs and allow them to participate in their lives fully. From a society perspective, we believe that we can build a safer roadway and have elasticity of supply, which will take those volatility that exists in the market and smooth it out. And then finally, the environment part, how can we do all of that and do it at zero emission at scale? And so when I brought up the labor piece and continued to hit home on labor with the guys at Kodiak, and Don's why is safety, and he's passionate about the safety aspect of it. So now we're like clicking off two big pieces, right? We're clicking off labor and we're clicking off safety. That environmental piece is just a part that can come with it. And so that's, I mean, from my seat, when you look at what Don's why was, it wasn't, oh, I just want to have the largest market cap as quickly as I can, right? It was, I want to create the safest Class 8 commercial vehicle. That's their North Star, right? And so I want to do that. I want to be the force multiplier of great driving jobs, which is weird to say when you're talking about why I want to deploy autonomous trucking, right? But really, that is what we want to do. We want to be the force multiplier of great first and last mile jobs.
You're doing good. And together, you're going to be able to scale. You're going to be able to create jobs. Together, the first and last mile will be highly coveted, well-paid jobs. Those individuals can go home to their families at night. They can go to a Little League game on a Saturday, have a barbecue on a Sunday because the technology is enabling. It's enabling a better lifestyle. Brett, in your opinion, what does the future of the freight industry look like?
Well, I think it just continues to grow. We're a nation of consumers, that's for sure. And so I think the future of the freight industry is that it continues to grow. I think that the driving job continues to be a job that is 1 in 10, 1 in 8, 1 in 7 people do because of the fact that we are such a consumer driven society. I'm particularly excited about what's happening in Mexico from a manufacturing perspective, simply because of the ability of having more freight moving into the United States from Mexico as opposed to China, not from a political perspective, but just from I think when you think about the consumer, when you go to buy something and it's not there, maybe you don't buy it, right? And so I want the shelves to always be full because that means that people are buying and ordering and there's more truckloads. And so I think that freight continues to be a business that expands. I do see, though, that there is a point in time where there can be some more consolidation in the industry. You have some very, very, very large players that exist in the industry. I would like to see like less of a drop off between the top and the bottom, right? I'd like there to be 150 freight brokerages that are doing 500 million to $1 billion in revenue, maybe like 150 that are 500 plus and 50 that are $1 billion plus. I think that freight brokerages, to be honest with you, provide a tremendous amount of value to the independent and smaller segment carrier. And the larger trucking companies with the 100,000 trailers or 50,000 trailers, they obviously have their place as well, especially with the new entrant of driver into the marketplace. You know, coming back to the insurance, if you're a small trucking company, you probably can't afford from an insurance perspective to hire somebody that doesn't have any experience. But the larger trucking companies do. And so they have their place from a capacity perspective, from a new driver entrant perspective. They obviously have a lot of real estate that they can deploy as needed. So I think that we just become more sophisticated. I think as the decision makers and policymakers have a turnover from a generational perspective, things like zero emission become more prevalent. I think things like the acceptance of autonomous become more widely embraced. So I'm really excited about the next, particularly for me, I'm 44, about to be 45 in a few months, 15 more years. Like I just really want, like I said, I want to go home on that Friday in 2035 and come back and realize that our network has gotten so smart that it balances itself. And I think that that's on the horizon. I don't think that I'm talking science fiction at this point. I think that we're just talking a matter of time and building the right way.
You're building the right way because you believe and the industry believes. And from my standpoint, you clearly understand the economics. You're right. We are a nation of consumers. Just look at the credit card spending and the credit card debt that's piling up. American consumers can't stop spending. Even inflation goes up, they keep on spending. Brett, this has been wonderful. It's the second time we've had you on the podcast. First time on the new Road to Autonomy Economy podcast. As we look to wrap up for today, until next time, and I want to hear you when you have the new AI announcement, what would you like our listeners and viewers to take away with them today?
All I want to say is that it's been a challenging market. The freight market has been challenging. A lot of people have been affected by that. There's a tremendous amount of compassion from our team at Loadsmith in terms of the people who have been affected by it, to the drivers that are out on the road and hauling freight that's not paying enough. We hear you. We understand it. We fight very hardly to increase rates. We really do. There can be a negative connotation with freight brokers in terms of, margins and those types of things. I can tell you it is not a big margin business from an investor perspective. Not a lot of investors are excited about the margins that we experience in our business. But the reality of it is that we do fight very hard to increase rates and to pay our carriers as fairly from a market perspective, from a cost-based perspective, and as timely and accurately and as quickly as we possibly can. I would venture to say that there's more freight brokerages that operate that way than not, but unfortunately, there can be a bad apple here and there. But the reality is that we appreciate the work that everybody does in this industry, and the market turnaround is coming. It's starting. I can see it. I can feel it. I can sense it. The horizon looks really good for us. And so if you're barely hanging on, please keep working hard. And this bottom has passed and we're moving in the right direction. It just is going to take some time for the market to catch up. So appreciate everybody's work. And again, hard business to be in. And it's been especially hard the last 18 months.
It's a hard business, but it's a good business. Keep on trucking. We're the backbone of this society. Loadsmith cares about drivers, and they're going to benefit drivers as they scale autonomy. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is Loadsmith. Brett, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy economy today.
All right. Thank you so much, Grayson. I appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices LLC to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.